What's up, gangsters? How about episode 12 of this little Spitfire adventure? With this one, I think we're going to get all the way up to the point where this thing is ready for its final coat of primer. Okay, so it is the next day, about 24 hours later exactly, and I have done almost all of the basic cleanup work on this fuselage seam. And so I want to just show you where I'm at, and I've left just this little bit right here so that I can demonstrate a little bit and make a couple of points. But you can kind of see I've worked all along that surface of the cowling. Getting down in between those two Zeus fasteners was a little bit tricky, but by being careful and using my Optivisor, as I always do when I'm doing finishing work, I think it's going to be fine. I still have a little bit of a gap, or a little bit of a low spot there. That was pretty bad though, so I may add a little bit more filler there. Now, one thing you'll see, hopefully, you'll be able to tell. It's pretty, it's pretty difficult to see some of these things on this gray surface, and this is exactly the point I'm about to make. What I've done here is all of the file work. Every bit of this cleanup has been done pretty much with files, and then I went back and made a couple of passes with a 600 grit Infinity sponge. Now, like I said, when you're using a sponge, you will wrap around the curvature of your fuselage, and you can end up doing way more work than you really want to. Okay, but if you have a light hand, you don't have to worry about that too much, and all I'm doing here is just smoothing off any roughness from my file work, so I'm only making a few passes. Now at 600 grit, that's still going to leave some scratches, and there are going to be some scratches in there from the file. Hopefully not too much, but it's just inevitable. Now, and I've learned this from experience, I could keep going and I could polish, sand and sand and sand and polish, and I could polish this plastic down to a slick mirror finish. And I would think it was pretty cool and I was in pretty good shape. And I guarantee, as soon as I put some primer on it, I would find scratches, and I would be annoyed because I would basically have to go back and redo the sanding work. So my strategy these days is to stop right here at this 600 grit point and not worry about those scratches as long as they're not any deeper than a couple of layers of primer. If they are, then I might come back right now and fix some of those things. If I had some bubbles or pits or any real serious issues, then I would take care of those. And you can see, okay, there are some scratches and some low spots if I get the angle just right. Okay, see where there's a little bit of a reflection right there, dead center of the screen. Okay, that's light bouncing off of low spots that are still shiny because none of my finishing tools have gotten down to them. Now, if those were deep enough, I'd want to go ahead and deal with them before going on to the next step. But they're not really deep enough to demand any actual filler like Bondo or sprue goo or whatever. So this is where what I've showed you guys before, my old bottle of All-Clad 309 primer comes in. This stuff is almost as thick as tar, not really, but still pretty thick, still has a lot of filler in it, and I will just brush that on there, and because it's really hot and it's a lacquer, it will bite into the plastic and it will dry really quickly. But it's definitely thick enough, much thicker than if it were sprayed on, to take care of the kind of little blemishes that I was showing you there. And because it's lacquer, it dries really quick and I can sand it back really fast and then come back over the top of that with my primer. But I don't really have anything that I need to worry about on that scale here because this surface was pretty good to start with. So let me go through the entire sort of process on this little section right here, which obviously is really important because it is a high visibility area. And hopefully I'll be able to do this. I'll be able to do this and keep things on camera. Let me try this. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Raise the camera up a little higher so that I hopefully will not bump into it as much. And we'll see how it goes. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to reach for is this file. Now, this file I'm going to use because I've got a pretty broad open area there. I know I'm not going to run into anything, but just to be on the safe side, let me take and put a little bit of tape across that gun sight. Takes 2 seconds to do that, as opposed to the who knows how long to fix it if I accidentally nick said gun sight. Just better to be safe than pissed off. Okay, so especially since I'm using a file that is not a safe edge file. A safe edge file would not have teeth on the edge. And it takes only a slight little swipe of that thing with one of those serrated corners to make a scratch. Alright? Now, if this seems like an enormous, brutal tool for this job, I understand. But here's what you have to think about when it comes to files. A file, even as large as this one is, and in the world of files, this is really not a big file, but in the world of scale modeling, obviously it's enormous. Every one of these teeth is just a tiny little knife blade that acts as a scraper. And assuming that the file is a good quality file, and it's truly flat, and none of the teeth are nicked, all of the edges of those teeth run through a common plane. And by definition, a plane and a cylinder can only contact along a line. So as long as you're careful, no matter what you do here, you're contacting a very small amount of the surface. And that's why the file can give you so much control, and why you can still maintain the profile even though you're working with this relatively enormous flat tool. Now, when you do want to go to a smaller one though, is anytime you feel like you've got to start manipulating the file to avoid nearby stuff. And that's where one of these little Suji burrito files like this, or like this really skinny one, come in super handy. But they have like half the pitch that this big one does, and they clog up pretty quickly. And that just becomes kind of a hassle, because whenever the file clogs up, that's when you start getting gouges in your work. So you have to pay attention to that. Alright, I've got most of that taken care of with the big file, but you can see, alright, I've still got a few low spots there. The edge of my filler material is still not feathered in, so Gonna come in here with the small one and work on that just a little bit more. Now files really are meant to be used only in one direction. You really should only push. But I cheat, and I actually find, especially with this really fine-toothed file like this one, that going back and forth is not a penalty, and it actually ends up producing a slightly smoother surface. Okay, so that's pretty much got that all knocked down, all right? And you can see that I have, if I could get on the camera and get it in focus, okay, you can see that I have a relatively controlled contact patch there. It's a little bit wider than I want, but that's a relatively flat surface on top of that cowl. And there's nothing there that I have to worry about. There's not any rivets or panel lines, so no big deal. And I really don't need to do too much more. And you can see exactly why I put that piece of tape on there. See where I nicked through it? Hopefully that did not leave a dingus in my paint that I have to fix. At any rate, now's the point where I'm going to come along with this thing, and I'm just going to use the edge of it because, again, I'm not really trying to do a lot of real finishing work here. I just want to smooth this out. And if I do have a little bit of a corner, so to speak, on the edge of my file patch, this is the time to deal with that by just taking a few swipes to blend that in. And if you've been working carefully, you should be in pretty good shape. All right, so there we go. All done and ready for spot primer. So now, also time to talk about the wing, because I have put that together pretty much 100% yesterday, and it's all happy. And what I did when I to make sure that this joint was good is I put the bottom portion of the wing on the fuselage. Actually, had the top pieces on there just loose, and once I had it on there, I taped the bottom portion in place at the back and the front, and making sure that it was tight. Then I wicked extra thin in along the joint, along the leading edge and everywhere else it needed it. And then holding it all together really tight, I just made sure to push this wing up against that edge of the fuselage where the wing root is. And there really isn't much play there. I mean, it's really minute, but it was enough to make that last little bit of difference and really give me a really nice joint along the along that wing root. And once that was all done, then of course I can just take it off and carry on with all my finishing work, which is a lot easier with it as a separate part, because now I can come back and doing my same operations, clean up the leading edge and anything else that needs it. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to do some spot primer, and we'll come back and take a look. One quick thing to add about files before we leave off of that. You are going to get buildup in the teeth with soft materials especially. That's just kind of the nature of the beast. And the thing that you have to do to keep those clean is keep a little wire brush like this handy. And you know, when you can't clean them up by wiping them on your sleeve like I do, then just go along and you know, card them. This, you know, they make tools specifically for this that are called file cards, and you know, get those cleaned up. There are people who say don't use a brass brush on your files, but that's silly. Brass is much softer than steel, hardened to steel for sure, and people use files to work on brass parts all the time. So why would you not be able to use a brass brush to clean your file teeth without causing damage? Especially, I mean, yeah, you'd have to be rubbing on this file for 100 years before you dull the teeth with this brush. Now, if you have little chunks of phlegm in your teeth, or they're just, you know, not getting completely clean like this, use some lacquer thinner or some acetone or some Tamiya extra thin on like a toothbrush or something to clean the rest of that out, and your file will be clean as new. Well, I decided to go ahead and add the tail feathers to this thing since I've done all of the brute force labor on the fuselage seams, and I have discovered an issue. Look at this. Hopefully you're not asking yourself what issue I'm talking about, because that gap right there next to the horizontal stabilizer, that is horrible, as they say in the Spanish lingo. Now, you can shove it all the way over to one side and close it up, so it's not a profile issue between the two parts, but obviously, even if you slide it back over to split the difference, you're going to have an unacceptable gap on either side. And the thing is, before anybody says you must have been doing it wrong, that's pretty much impossible, because this whole top surface is one piece. All you do is add these two pieces on either side, as you can see here in the instructions. So for that part A12, you don't have any control over the dimension between the left and the right side. It is what it is. But that also gives us a method for solving the problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just separate those two things by slicing it in two right down the middle here and separating this little overlapping joint right there. So I'll do that and come back. Okay, so what I did was pretty straightforward. I just separated these two pieces, the left and the right. I did it by putting the point of an X-Acto in there, into that joint between the two halves of this little tab right here, and then just levering it over until I had sliced through the glue joint. And then I used my Zurons to just chop the thing in two. And I trimmed a little bit off the tip of each one of these little things. And I've stuck this left piece in here and glued it. And you can see that I have now got a perfect joint there on top. Not quite so perfect on the bottom. Now that's workable. I can fill that in, and you know, it's not going to show much. But it's possible that if I had not put these lower pieces in already, in other words, if I had done what I just did with the upper piece, put it in and stuck it in place, then came and added this piece on the bottom, that I might have had enough slop to where I could push it over and close up that gap at the root, kind of similar to the way that I did on the wings. But that might have left me with a less perfect join around the leading edge here, and that's really the most important one. So I don't know, that's something to experiment with. But the question now is, will this right hand side piece go in? I trimmed a little bit off the end of the resulting tab before I stuck the left side one in there. So we'll see if it was enough and if this one will go all the way in. Feels like maybe almost. Whoops. And this is kind of disappointing. I'm really scratching my head here because this is not the sort of thing that can be that's user error because of the way that it's designed. And that's always the beauty of Tamiya's system, and the way that they engineered this really eliminates a lot of the inherent weakness to the way that these horizontal stabilizers go on a lot of model kits, especially if they just plug in from either side like I've ended up doing anyway. It's a brilliant design, so it's a little it's actually really disappointing that it resulted, because they just maybe were a little sloppy in their tolerancing in that gap. It'll be interesting to know if other builders see the same issue. It's still going to be pretty good because it's a nice snug fit, but it's just not quite the same. Now, this won't go all the way in, so I'm going to trim it a little bit, and I'm going to do exactly the kind of thing that they say you're not supposed to do with this kind of nippers, but which is made very easy and very precise with this kind of nippers. Just like that. It's like having a miniature X-Acto blade and a miniature thumb, so you can do that motion where you hold the blade, you hold the knife with your hand, and then push it with your, push against the cut with your thumb, but which I can't do because of my horrible dexterity. So let's see now if that will go all the way in there, and yep, sure enough, it does. Yeah, see, this is resulting in all kinds of hassle that really shouldn't have to be happening. So let me wick some extra thin in there and push that over. Not too much. I got way too much glue in there, like I always do. I am a serial over gluer. I just always end up squirting too much extra thin into a joint like that, and spooges back out, and then I have cleanup to do. This looks like it's going to be pretty good though. See, I have now got a nice tight joint, and actually on this one it turned out to be perfect on the bottom as well. Now the question is, though, how well does it all line up? Because the way that it was resulted in a nice straight tail plane, and it looks like I still have everything looking pretty good. I don't see any obvious misalignment. Certainly nothing that would attract the ire of an IPMS judge. So now I want to take and put a little bit of glue back in there to take care of that. And I'm going to let that sit up, and then I'll come back and I'll put the photo etch piece that goes in there in place a little later and add the rudder. It'll be all good. Alrighty, so this is taken care of. Pretty happy with the way that turned out on the top side, but yeah, still had to deal with that gap underneath there. Now, I chose to use the Mr. Surfacer 500 and wet removal method for this. If you don't know what that is, what that means is basically, because Mr. Surfacer 500 is just a thick, goopy lacquer resin, basically. You can use it to fill in something like that, because it will sink into the joint, and then you use a mild lacquer thinner like this Tamiya lacquer thinner to work it down using a Q-tip. And this is a really nice method when you either cannot or don't want to do any sanding. And this is exactly that kind of situation, because this is hard to get to, and because it's on the bottom and it's so well obscured by the rudder control horn. Well, okay, not super obscured by that, kind of obscured by that. Anyway, it's just not very visible, and I don't feel compelled to do a proper joint treatment on it where I fill it, sand it, and rescribe it. If this were going to be a contest model, then maybe I would, but yeah, not for that. You can see there's a couple of little bubbles there. Not going to get too worried about those for all the aforementioned reasons. I may, I'll just squirt a little extra lacquer in there when I spot prime it, and we'll see how it looks. So anyway, that takes care of that. And now, speaking of spot primer, gonna go do that. All right, so that's done. Let's take a look and see where we are. Just so you know, probably already did, this is Mr. Surfacer 1500 that I keep mixed up in this little squirt bottle for maximum efficiency. And I just thin it with Mr. Leveling Thinner. That works fine, and it doesn't evaporate quite as easily, so that's good. All right, now, you will see exactly what I was talking about. The first purpose of spot priming, okay, because you're probably looking at this and some of you guys are like, well, why didn't you just spray the whole thing? Well, I could, but it's not really efficient because most of this is going to get sanded off. Because the first purpose of spot priming is as a diagnostic tool, so that I can see exactly what I'm up against, much better than I can on gray plastic. And there you go. There's the horror show of scratch marks and gouges from all of my finishing work that I was talking about. And none of those are really bad, but I know from experience that what I need is a very thin filler. And that's the second purpose of spot priming, is to let the primer do its work as a micro filler. So I've sprayed 3 pretty thick layers on there. And what I'm hoping is that when I do my finish sanding on that it will be enough to fill in all those scratches. We'll see. If it's not, then I'll do it again and I'll repeat. But the bottom line is that what I'm looking for is, have I handled the most important thing, which is the joint? And I think I'm in pretty good shape there. Mostly in good shape back here. A little bit of a telltale right there. We'll see how that looks after some sanding. You can see this all looks pretty good. That's a little bit proud, or right there on the front corner by the leading edge on the right hand side. Not too bad. Let's see how the work looks on the bottom. About like I expected. I mean, it's not really a gap anymore. It's just a super deep panel line, so that's not bad. You can see that I did go ahead and spray the whole lower surface of those stabilizers, and yeah, because I'm spot priming. But if I have extra in my airbrush when I'm done with that job, I'm obviously not going to waste it. I'll just go ahead and blow it on some surface that's going to end up needing it anyway. So that part's all good. The work on the belly of the tail looks pretty good. And same thing here. Let's see what happened on the wings. This leading edge was really pretty tight. So I'm pretty pleased with how that looks. And this is an important step because it'll let you know if you're creating any kind of a flat spot on that leading edge, which you obviously do not want. But I think it's pretty good. So, do some sanding, come back and take a look. Alright, so the horror show is slightly less horrific. Maybe. I will be the first to admit that this looks pretty rough, but it is actually not rough at all because, like I was saying, that primer has done one of its most important jobs, which is to fill in all of those scratches. And I fully expect that when I spray the next layer of primer on that it's going to look pretty good. So, but, you know, we'll see. One thing I've learned is to never assume that your bodywork is perfect because that's a good way to lose a bet. It's just the nature of it. You know, you just have to actually do the work and carry all the way through the process before you can really come to any solid conclusions. And I've just found that even though I work in an optivisor and I can see all these little flaws pretty clearly, that it's just super easy to miss stuff, no matter how careful and how observant you are. So, at any rate, I think the wing looks pretty good. Like I said, that leading edge was just really pretty nice, pretty tight. I don't think it's going to require much, if any, more work. Now, this was also the time to take care of a very important step, and that is handling all of these panel lines that cross over the seams that I've worked to take care of. And I've done all of them, and I didn't really want to spend a lot of time on camera illustrating that, but it's pretty straightforward. I feel like that for a seam that goes over a convex, yeah, I think this is convex, it's an outie, not an innie, right? A seam that goes over an outie is best handled by a razor saw, typically with a straight blade. Sometimes this one with the curved blade works pretty good. Like I used it on these seam lines running across the root of the leading edge right there, and that worked pretty good. But regardless, these are the Tamiya fine razor saws. And you can see they are 0.15 millimeters thick. They're actually a little bit too thick for this kit because it has such sweet, fine panel lines. And there is a skinnier version that is only 0.1 millimeters thick. And that's also the same as this RB Productions razor saw. So I started using that as well. But the process is pretty simple. Basically, all you're doing is using the existing panel line as your guide. And you lay the saw in there where you know you've got good guidance, and watch what you're doing so that you can make sure that it's headed for meeting up with the panel line on the opposite side of the seam, and you just start working your way over. And just doing it gradually, doing it very carefully until you've got it, until it meets up. Now, I mentioned before that there was a little bit of a misalignment in the fuselage, and I really wish I had discovered that before all the glue was set up, because that kind of thing, even when it's very slight, will obviously throw off your panel lines joining each other the way that they're supposed to. And you know, you have to just get a little tricky. I can't really tell you a whole lot other than that's just one of those times when you just have to use your skills and make things work. I've got one right here. It's a little bit hard to see, but I've got one right here where I really did have to work with it a little bit. And what you do is you make your first pass with the saw blade perpendicular to the surface and get it all joined, you know, get the line segments connected. And then if you see that it's not looking quite straight, then you have to start cheating the sides of the line a little bit. And what I do is I tilt the saw over so that it's really working on the side of that little channel rather than on the depth of the channel. And I'll widen it out a little bit on this side, widen it out a little bit on this side, and it's, you gotta be, you know, you gotta be real subtle about it, because you don't want to make the panel line look like it's, you know, huge when the rest of it is really skinny. But the bottom line is, if you can't make it work and you have to fill it back in with some sprue goo and polish it down and make the entire panel line from scratch, that's not the worst thing in the world. Yeah, it's a bit of a setback, but it's not the worst thing. I feel okay about these, and like I don't need to redo any of them. So that's all good. Now, one thing that I did realize is this little hole right here. I kept thinking, what is that there for? Well, that is for the gun sight on the earliest Spitfires, and you can see that that does not go in until you get, let's see, where is it? Where is it? Clear back here to step 28. You can see where that part number B8 plugs in there, but only if you're building version B. If you're building A or C, which I am, that does not go there. Same thing with these, they call them molding stickers. I guess it's, you know, supposed to represent an extra piece of sheet metal there or something. Those you will not use if you're doing the A or the C version. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick that little antenna piece in that, or not antenna, that little gun sight piece in that hole with some extra thin, and then just slice it off and hope that it fills the hole as much as it needs to, and that I don't have to do any additional filler. But we'll see. Also need to add the rudder horn on back here. That's looking, I think, decent enough where I'm going to go ahead and put that in place. And that'll be everything pretty much. And probably going to go ahead and get the wing and the fuselage put together as well. I think it's time to go ahead and do that. Okay, so it is like 15 minutes later, and this, I just have to go on and gush about this for a second. Look at that fuselage to wing joint. I mean, is that just not a thing of beauty or what? This is why we just love and respect Tamiya. I mean, you got to give them credit. I'm not going to say this kit is perfect. At this point, I've assembled 90% of it, and I feel like it is pretty damn close. I mean, honestly, the only two things that I would nitpick about at this point are having this little piece of the cowling up here separate. And I get that they want to do that to make separate versions possible with less tooling real estate. But honestly, for a kit like this, especially where you've got so little room to work the joint between those Zeus fasteners, I just think, you know, in terms of being purely model maker friendly, they should just have gone ahead and made that one piece. I don't know that anybody would have noticed the additional cost of having to, you know, to do it that way. The thing with the tail, that's a weird deal. Right after I showed that, I took some pictures and made a post on SMCG, and a bunch of dudes chimed in, and nobody else really had much of an issue. One guy did show a little bit of a gap, but nobody had as much of a gap as I did. And you know, it's a weird thing, and I am like the last one to ever say, well, you must have got a bad kit, because yeah. Especially with a company that's got as good process control as Tamiya does, that's just rarely going to be the case. It's almost always either the entire kit is bad, and you'll see a lot of really weird things, or it's a craftsmanship issue. You will rarely just see one thing like that that's weird, but there's a first time for everything, and this is, because there is just physically no possible way to screw that up. I mean, there's just not any, you know, the only way that you could make that gap larger than it's supposed to be is if you somehow got this fuselage too narrow. And yeah, I put a little clamping force on it, but I would have had to smash it into oblivion to make it any narrower than it was, because it's just, you know, it's so solid. There's really not any way to do that. So the only thing I can conclude is that something a little weird is going on with the either the length of this part that caused it to be too long, or maybe there is something going on with this fuselage, because the fuselage lines up perfectly up here, but it is a little weird back here, and you can see, you know, there's some evidence of that misalignment there in that opening for the radio mast, and again, I don't know how I could have introduced that misalignment there. I mean, it's always possible. I'm not a perfect craftsman, but it is kind of, you know, it is kind of a weird thing when the front part of the fuselage lines up perfectly and the back part is not quite as perfect. Regardless, you know, going back to this fuselage to wing joint, I mean, come on, that's just gorgeous, and that, as far as I'm concerned, that makes up for any of these other little niggles, because you know how much work you're going to wrap up in dealing with that joint if it's not good, especially on a Spitfire, where it's a complicated thing to rescribe and re-rivet if you end up having to do that. So anyway, I just wanted to show you guys that and have a look at that before I cover all that up with primer. You can see that I've gone ahead and added that little gun sight piece in there. It's probably going to need a little bit of filling, but that's an easy thing to do. I put the rudder control horn in, and that's a little bit of a bummer, because it is not, the linkage is not quite long enough, but I'm not going to get too hung up on that. I guess you could say that maybe one thing with this kit, I typically like to kick my rudders at a little bit of a jaunty angle, and it's pretty common for Spitfires on the ground to have the elevators drooping. And if you want to do either one of those two things, it's going to be a little bit more work than maybe with some other kits, because you're going to have to get in there with a saw and do some modifying to be able to do either one of those things. But that's not something that you can really call as an imperfection in a kit like this, because that's purely elective surgery. So anyway, yeah, sweetness. Okay, so here we are back at it. Another day has passed, and I have gone back and done my second round of spot priming. And I know some of you guys are looking at this process and going, yeah, you know, this really seems inefficient and time consuming. And my very quick response to that is, look, this is not about efficiency. If that's your number one goal here, then this is probably not the right hobby for you. You know, good body work just takes time, and it's a process, it's iterative, and you just keep working it. But I wanted to show you guys the results of the sanding. I haven't done any additional sanding. This is exactly as it was sprayed just a little bit ago, and you can see that I was pretty much right in my estimation that this was all going to look nice and smooth with that next coat of primer on it. There's a few little bits of flurm in there that I need to sand out, no big deal, and the place where I did the fill on that little hole right there is not so perfect, but that may disappear under some sandpaper. I'm fairly pleased with the way that the spine looks. Really, I just went around and resprayed everything that I had worked on. That's the basic strategy, and you can see that leading edge looks nice. I went ahead and also added the chin piece, and I just about screwed the pooch on that, because as usual, it seems like no matter how much I say it out loud and remind myself not to be such an overgluer, I still do it. And I wasn't thinking, when I put the chin piece on here, I dropped a big drop of glue right in here, and it flowed all the way through this joint, and some of it came spooging out, of course, right in between those Zeus fasteners, and I had to spend some time under an optivisor digging and scraping that to get it smooth. And I'm pleased it's not too bad. Still going to need another little bit of work there. But now what I'll do, that I can see what's really going on, I'll get after it with one of my secret weapons. This, for me, is one of my most powerful and effective sanding tools. This is a piece of Infini sponge that, and I think this is 1000 grit, which is a little bit fine for doing, basic body work, but it's what I had handy. And anyway, the point being is that with it in these gripper tweezers, even with my terrible dexterity, this is what really lets you get into areas that are difficult to work with. You need to get up next to something tight, or down in a like a wing root. Just any place where you need the conforming quality of a sponge, but you need a relatively small piece, and you need something good to hold it with. This is the way to go. I use this trick all the time. Okay, so that's going to wrap it up for all of the actual activity in this portion of the video build log. But I want to finish up by talking a little bit about the issue that I brought up the other day with the tail, because this is still bugging me. There was quite some discussion about it on Scale Modeler's critique group, and a couple of people were like, "Man, are you sure that really must be user error? What, how can it be a problem with the kit parts?" And look, they're not wrong. Okay, after many years of doing a lot of mechanical work, rebuilding engines and all kinds of things on my motorcycles, I learned that if something doesn't go together the right way, if it doesn't look right, if you find yourself having to force things or beat on them to get them to go together, chances are you're doing something wrong. That should really be your default assumption. But that doesn't mean that it's always the case. Because I am so skeptical of it being a problem with the kit, I'm really, I always try to really examine what I've done and try and figure out, okay, could I have caused this problem? So since I was on the phone with a friend this morning, and he's building the same thing, he had his kit, and I asked him to take some pictures for me, because one of the things that occurred to me was that if you look here where the slot is that the horizontal stabilizer slides into, that it might have been possible with some clamping force on the outside of the fuselage, which I did use a little bit of clamping force, not enough to squeeze any material out of the joint, but I thought maybe it was possible that I squeezed that part of the fuselage together a little bit and maybe even glued it together inside there inadvertently, and that resulted in it being too narrow. So I got him to take some pictures for me, and I am pleased that I can show you that that is just not physically possible. Okay, what I've been saying is not that it's impossible for me to have made a mistake with this, but that it's pretty much impossible for anybody to make a mistake with this, because you can see that those ridges that the horizontal stabilizer part rests on don't come anywhere close to touching each other. And if, in fact, you smashed the thing so hard that you squeezed it together right there, that you would probably also be smashing that piece right there that the tail wheel attaches to. So again, I'm still scratching my head about this, but I am like 99.9% certain that this was not a user error, and that there is in fact a discrepancy in the dimensions of the part. And the question is, which part, because there's three parts that are involved here. It's the single piece that represents the top of the horizontal stabilizers, and given that everything else on that sprue fit fine, yeah, probably not that. But the sprue that had the fuselage on it, well, okay, that's the next suspect, because you've got the left and right halves of the fuselage. But everything here fits pretty good. Well, sort of, okay? Take a look at this, all right? Obviously, the wing joint is amaze balls. Talked about that already. So that must be pretty good. And if you look, everything forward of the cockpit is great, okay? And you can tell because you can look at the opening for the fuel filler cap, which I'm not going to put in until later because I don't want to have to mask it off, all right? Both sides of that circular cutout line up perfectly. The line across the front of the cockpit opening is straight. There was no issue with the line across the front of the cowling right here where we attached this little nose piece. All of that stuff lines up front to back the way it's supposed to. But as I was pointing out, look what happens as you move towards the rear. You can see that the opening there for the aerial mast, not so perfectly lined. And the only reason that this edge of the cockpit is perfectly straight is because I filed a little bit of it off. It had a little bit of misalignment as well. And as I was talking about underneath here, there was some misalignment with these panel lines that cross the joint. And you can really see that they are kind of crooked, and I'm not too happy about that, but again, not going to worry about it because it's underneath. But the reason that this line right here is so straight is, again, because I filed a little bit of it off. It had a discrepancy, okay? So there is something going on, and you can see it when you look at the opening for the tail wheel, and I've cleaned that out a little bit, but there was a substantial misalignment between the two sides of that hole. Now, obviously, that misalignment does not affect the width of the fuselage where this piece slides in there. But my point is that everything is not perfect back here. Something weird is going on, at least in my copy of the kit. And again, before you jump to, well, maybe you did something when you clamped this together, or whatever. Well, Mark, my friend who's also building this, dry fit his fuselage halves together and saw the exact same misalignment with these features behind the cockpit. So again, look, sometimes things are just weird, and even with Tamiya, where their process control is so good and their engineering is so good, there is just the reality that sometimes shit happens and parts are out of dimension, out of tolerance, and you know that it's just a thing. And of course, you know, as model makers, we have to figure out how to deal with that and you know, still try to get nice looking results in spite of it. So anyway, that's it. That's enough of me waffling on about this. Time to get cracking. All right, that's about enough of that. My plan is that I will probably go ahead and finish sanding and priming this. Not really too much more to do. Just a few touch-up sanding spots. And when I come back to it in the next installment, it will be all primed, and it will be time to paint, start the actual paint, which will be fun. I'm looking forward to that. But I also have some decisions to make in the meantime about my colors and everything. I mean, it's going to be RAF dark green and dark earth on top, but I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do with the bottom. If it's going to be sky or if I'm going to do the black and white one or what. I don't know yet. One other thing that I have to do, and I'll talk about this in the next installment, is get the canopy, the windscreen definitely fitted on here. And that means that I need to do some masks. And I've elected on this project to do the trick of scanning the masks from the kit, because we all know Tamiya, for some crazy reason, doesn't cut them for you. So I'm going to scan them and load them into my Silhouette Portrait 2 cutter and cut them myself out of Oramask 810 vinyl and see how that goes. So, but we'll get into all that in the next installment. One last thing that I kind of want to leave you with here, because of what I was saying about the issues with the fuselage and the tail thing. You will run into this a lot in the model making community, where you will see a problem with a kit and you bring it up and you'll immediately get a chorus of, I never had a problem. Went together great for me. And at a certain point, it's crazy making, because you really start to question your own vision and your own judgment. And I just want to encourage you guys, when you see something weird, make sure that you really are seeing it. Double check yourself, because yeah, chances are it's you. But once you've gone through the process and even if it means getting out a pair of digital calipers, once you know that there is actually an issue with the kit, or at least your copy of it, stick to your guns. Because the bottom line is, there are a lot of builders out there who just don't see it, or just don't care, or just don't remember. And if they start giving you a hard time about what you've actually seen, well, screw those guys. It is what it is. So anyway, that's enough of that. And as always, I appreciate you watching and sticking along with this. And I hope that you're finding it useful. Much love.